I will speak about our speaker, who is a scholar of strategy. Phillips O'Brien was born and raised in Boston. Boston, is that right? And now he lives in Scotland, where at the University of St. Andrews, he is professor of strategic studies. He, up until very recently, he was the head of the School of International Relations, and is now moving on to a more research-centered career. He is author of 6 books, among them the 2024 book, whose title, The Strategists, inspired this year's conference theme. And most recently, War and Power, Who Wins Wars and Why, published about 6 months ago by Penguin Viking, and then republished here in the United States. I'll mention that the UW bookstore, textbooks outlet downstairs, has a few copies still available that have not been purchased by students. I think the Barnes & Noble's on the way, and the UW bookstore also on the way to the hotel might have a few copies there too, of War and Power. Professor O'Brien is a regular contributor to Foreign Affairs and The Atlantic and many other publications that are too many to number. He posts almost daily, or sometimes twice daily, on Blue Sky, the social media of the growing social media meeting place of scholars worldwide. He has about 50,000 followers there. His Substack, with 115,000 subscribers, has continued now for some time to be the #1 bestseller Substack for international studies. He's a public-facing scholar, sharing daily his newest ideas, and that's going to be today. Professor O'Brien, my guess is that more than a few people in the room have watched your online conversation with Timothy Snyder about a week ago, and some probably read your post from this morning, "The USA does not understand war." It's a deep, very difficult, very painful read. The USA does not understand war. The world has changed a lot, though, since then, since last week, since this morning. So we're now hoping to hear your updated, most recent thoughts on the topic that interests us, Europe's strategy in the Ukraine war, as of today, 6:15 Pacific time. And so please join me in welcoming Professor Phillips O'Brien.
I really don't know what to say after that introduction. That was incredibly kind, but I would also like to extend my thanks to Guntis and the team for the extraordinary organizing that's gone into this. It really has been, from my point of view, seamless and easy, and has made traveling across the Atlantic very, very easy. So thank you very much for having me. Two words of warning before we start. One, for the last few years, everyone leaves every talk I give really depressed. I have spent much of my time putting people close to tears. I will try not to do that today, but I don't think you're going to leave this talk feeling better about yourselves and the world. Just a warning. The second is I make the dullest PowerPoints in the University of St. Andrews. I'm legendary for them, so don't expect exciting PowerPoints. Students usually say, but it's just words. And that's what they are. When Gunn just asked me to give this talk, it seemed on the surface in many ways quite seductively easy, a strategy for Europe. Okay, I can do that. I study strategy. I study European-US relations. I've been talking a lot about the Russia-Ukraine war. But the more I thought about it, the more perplexed I was, because of course, to be honest, there is no strategy for Europe. Europe does not exist in a strategic world. There is no European, pan all of Europe body that makes strategy. The European Union does not contain all of Europe. The European Union in some ways does not even make strategy. So I'm being asked to discuss something that arguably does not exist. There are many different Europes when it comes to the making of strategy. But I thought I would then use that as a challenge. That what I would do is talk about how the different levels of Europe or European states have tried to deal with the questions of a strategy, focusing primarily on the Russia-Ukraine war and European-US relations to this point, and then be a little hopeful about where things are going. I think I can actually be more hopeful now than I could have been, say, if this were December 2025, because there have been some interesting changes in the way the European states and institutions are looking about strategy from a European perspective. So the last part of the lecture will actually try to say, actually, what a European strategy might be. However, I'm going to start by depressing you. And I'm going to start in the summer of 2024. And that was when I was writing this article with a co-author named Edward Stringer, who's from the United Kingdom, for Foreign Affairs. And we thought it was a really, really simple, non-contentious article, but one that needed to be written. And it was the sketch, the most simple plan for European states to prepare for Donald Trump's possible return to the White House. Okay. It was the summer of 2024. It was a two-horse race. This was a 50-50 proposition. So it didn't seem to us wildly radical that European states should start thinking, okay, Donald Trump might be president again in a few months' time. Trump had made his antipathy towards Europe more than commonly known. He hadn't hidden it. He had made his antipathy towards the European Union widely known, and that Europeans started to need to prepare for this as a logical possibility. So we wrote this article in Foreign Affairs. It came out, was it September 6th? We wrote it sort of in the course of August. And we thought, okay, it might cause a little controversy, but hopefully people will see it as productive. And what we got in that was the most extraordinary private negative feedback by European policymakers. They didn't come out, no one publicly took it on. But we were contacted by some very senior European policymakers who basically said, you shouldn't say that out loud. It was totally not what we were expecting. It was a combination of wishful thinking. On the one hand, Trump won't win. Don't go there. Don't do this. Trump's not going to win. Or if Trump wins, it won't be so bad, so don't be an alarmist. Or the other one is, if Trump wins and is bad, we can't do anything about it anyway, so we don't want to think about it now. No, these were the sort of the different levels of reaction that we were receiving from European policymakers. And I think this led to a really, Edward and I had this, we actually got together to talk about this reaction because I think we were a little bit stunned. And actually, it was Edward who started talking. He is a former RAF Air Marshal and had been very senior in the British Ministry of Defense. And what Edward sort of said is, they just don't know how to think for themselves. That was the fundamental problem. What European states have happened, what has happened, arguably since 1945, is that European states had lost the ability to think strategically in their own interest. They had outsourced that to the United States. Right? So they didn't think, they were great about planning their welfare states. They were great about planning their social policies. They were great on certain elements of internal domestic politics. But it came to their worldwide status and thinking about European security based on European resources. And that's what the article was saying. Europeans need to start thinking about European security based on what Europe can do. They had lost the ability to do it. They had what we call no muscle memory. The muscles had atrophied. And what happened is they had become utterly strategically dependent on the United States. They had not thought ever that they would be in a situation where they might actually have to secure themselves, to defend themselves, without the USA there to do the heavy lifting. In some ways, you could say they had been infantilized. That was, I think, a real eye-opener, just how terrified. The reaction we got was actually terror. They were terrified to go down this road of thinking what their strategy would be. And it really changed a lot of my view. I have to say, I look at the world very differently now than I did in January of 2021. And that's one of them, was just the level of fear in Europe to think about themselves. The other thing it changed is it made me realize that when Europeans were quote-unquote anti-American, a lot of it was nonsense. They loved the United States. They didn't want to live without the United States. They wanted the United States there to defend them. that had been so hardwired into their way of dealing with security issues that they really couldn't conceive of it not happening. So Europeans are actually, were instinctively far more pro-American than we, I think, understood at that time. So it masks this strategic independence. And I think that is the only way to talk about, I'm going to sort of build to the present, but I'm going to start by looking at the years 2022 to 2024. Because that was this, you might call it quite a painful period, a difficult period, one which confronts European policymakers with something they did not see happening. That up until 2022, the general European leadership element was that, one, Russia won't invade Ukraine. Okay, that was very commonly. The German government said, until the moment the Russian tanks crossed the border, this was not going to happen. You know, they were saying, the Russians are not going to invade. You know, that's not going to occur. Or the other view is, if it happens, Ukraine's doomed anyway, so there's nothing we can do. That was sort of the double reaction that you had in Europe. What they did not expect was a long-term war exploding on the European continent that would grow and get progressively bigger and bigger. That was something that was not factored into their thinking in any way. So it was either going to be no war at all or a quick war and a Russian victory. But they were presented with this war situation to which they had no preparation, and you might say no actual ability, past ability to fall back on. What it showed at this point, from 2022 to 2024, is that there was no Europe. There were probably 4 Europes when it came to confronting this strategic challenge. Right? There was no European unity. In fact, there's no European unity today, but there was in many ways even less European unity from 2022 to 2024. If I were going to break European states up into groups, I would say on the one hand, there was the "we want Ukraine to win" group, which is smaller than you would think. All right, you might say that's the Baltics, the Nordics, at times Romania, at times Poland, at times Czech, depending on who's running Czech. And these are states that ultimately want Russia defeated. That you could tell it's a geography question. The closer you are to Russia, the more likely you are in the we want Ukraine to win. Except for, of course, Hungary, but that now might change. But that was that group. But it's smaller than you think. And other than Poland, and Poland's had a somewhat uneasy relationship with Ukraine, that group contained none of the traditional large powers of Europe. All right, it wasn't the British, French, and Germans. They're not in that "we want Russia defeated" group, or they certainly were not in that group from 2022 to 2024. What they were in the group of is I'll call the "we don't want Ukraine defeated," and that's different than saying we want Ukraine to win. All right, their view is they don't want Ukraine to be wiped off the map. They don't want Russia to take all of Ukraine. But on the other hand, they also don't want Russia to lose too badly. They didn't want a Russian defeat that would be, in their minds, destabilizing to Europe. They wanted the war over as soon as possible. Their view is to have some sort of fudge deal. So we don't want Ukraine to lose, but we also don't want Russia to be too badly defeated. And this is sort of this area which would have taken in, I would say, the 3 traditional powers of Europe, the British, the French, and the Germans, were all in that in different ways. All right? They might have been rhetorically different. The British were slightly more pro-Ukraine rhetorically. The Germans were slightly more restrained rhetorically. But actually, in terms of what they do, the differences aren't as vast as you think. So there's the "we want Ukraine to win" group and the "we do not want Ukraine to lose" group. Those are 2. Then there was, and we have to admit, the pro-Putin group. They were there. All right? Orban was the leader of it, but he was also joined by Robert Fico of Slovakia, and he's now probably joined by the new Czech prime minister. So that has been that kind of swip. But these are groups that are actually, in many ways, what's come out about the Orban regime's relationship with Russia is shocking in the last few weeks. I don't know if you're paying attention, but basically they were spying on the European Union for the Russians. So that the Hungarian foreign minister would get on the phone with the Russian foreign minister and pass over news about what the Europeans are doing. So there is, and that remains still, we have the Czech Republic and we have Slovakia that I don't think we'd say are trustworthy members of any group other than somewhat supportive of Russia. And that has to be absolutely admitted. And there's what we call the sort of detached group. You know, that there's a lot of European states like Spain, probably Italy, that, you know, are rooting for Ukraine, but they were not as invested as you might think. You know, they gave very small amounts of aid, and they didn't play a large role. They were quite good in terms of giving speeches, some of them, but they were not engaged. So they would be even a step back. They just, you know, weren't going to get involved too much. And that grouping of European states and those 4 different divisions meant that it was even just so much easier to let the US do the running. You know, there was no attempt to come up with a common European policy. None that I can see in any meaningful way. The European Union had some discussions, but really what the Europeans did, because of the way they had been programmed, the visions they had, is they punted it to NATO and said to the United States, you take the lead and we will do what you want. So from 2022 to 2024, what we had was a US written strategy for Europe. The European strategy was written in Washington. There was nothing that I would call a European strategy. And this starts bringing up, I think, some profoundly important questions that I'm going to spend a minute or two talking about. The first is, which is, I think, would have a different answer now than Europeans might have given a year ago, is was this US strategic view in Europe's interest? Okay. This was the first time certain Europeans, they didn't want to face it, but started saying, particularly those close to Ukraine and the Ukraine should win group, is to what degree does the US actually reflect our interests? You know, or is the US reflecting a very different kind of interest that we don't view? We don't. Certainly what came out very early is that Washington policymaking was overwhelmingly what I'll call Moscow-centric. They cared about what happened to Russia in this war. They didn't really, I mean, Biden was very good. He wanted to help Ukraine. He went to Ukraine. But they didn't view Ukraine as the key issue. They viewed the fate of Russia and how Russia came out of this war to be the key thing, which I would say is a fundamentally different way than the Baltics, the Nordics, and the Ukraine should win group did it. That they had, and by the way, that was a policy background. I mean, that Washington policy has come out of Soviet/Russian studies departments in the United States. That I did a study on the military analysis, why the military analysis was so bad up to the invasion, full-scale invasion in February of 2022, and I did this study by 2024. Why did everyone think Ukraine would collapse? The Russians were so strong. And what it turned out is everyone who was a military analyst actually called themselves a Russian military analyst. No one called themselves Ukrainian military analysts. They were all Russian military analysts. Most of them had spent time going to, say, like the Valdai Discussion Club. That you had this very Russian-centric, Moscow-centric, professional establishment, policy-making establishment in Washington. And what this dynamic then did is reframe the war strategically on its effect on Russia. They had what I would call, I mean, it was interesting to have these discussions in Washington in 2022, 2023. They had what I'd call the collapse escalation dynamic, or the Goldilocks strategy. They wanted to navigate between 2 very Russian-centric concerns. One, they did not want a Russian collapse. That was a key element of US policy. All right? They did not want to press Russia and see Russia so badly defeated that it could lead to instability and the collapse of the Russian state. So maintaining Russia was a much higher US priority even under Biden than people realized. They didn't want that to happen. And the second thing, they didn't want to, in their mind, press Putin too far that he might go nuclear. So it's sort of the collapse escalation dynamic. That was actually the number one concern when the US is making its policy. It's trying to have a way that Russia doesn't succeed too much, but that Russia also doesn't collapse. Within that, Ukraine was, I would say, a secondary concern. They're very much, they fit in that second group in Europe. We don't want Ukraine to disappear. We don't want Ukraine to win. But we also, don't look at Ukraine as the key issue in the war. And what happened from the European point of view is that fit enough of the larger powers' concerns that what Europe did as a whole was simply defer to Washington. You tell us. It really was, you tell us what we can do. And we will do that. And that meant that Washington exercised enormous control over how Europe aided Ukraine. On the one hand, Europe handed over some stuff, but only the kind of material Washington wanted them to hand over. And they had when I wrote that thing today about how the US doesn't understand war, that's the kind of thing that was in my mind. The Biden administration was desperate not to, in their mind, make Ukraine too strong. They didn't want Ukraine to threaten Russia too much for the escalation collapse dynamic, so they were always delaying things like fighter jets or advanced anti-air systems or long-range strike, because that was not something that the United States wanted Ukraine to have because of that dynamics. And that was when I think you started having people, particularly in the Baltics, I've become quite friendly with the people in the Baltics, and they started saying, well, is the US actually representing our interests, or are they trying to keep Russia stronger than we would like? But this was a minority opinion in Europe. I would say that 2022 to 2024. And ultimately for European states, I think what came out, it was a question, as I said, of location and risk tolerance. Where you were played a massive role in how you judge it. But there was no Europe. And really, there was even no European consensus. The strategy for this point was being written in Washington. Then we have the cosmic break of 2025. For the first year, the Europeans tried to pretend there was no break. This was, I think, this is where Ed Stringer and I, in our article, I went into a profound, I was really depressed in 2025. The second Trump presidency comes around, and what do European states do? Actually, the experience we had and the reaction to our piece was exactly right. They try to say, okay, we are so desperate to keep the United States committed to Europe, we will do anything to please Trump. So for most of 2025, what they do is they try very hard to pretend nothing has changed, that Trump could be won around, Trump was malleable, he might even support Ukraine, that the key thing to get to Trump was to flatter him, to tell him how wonderful he was, that as the famous daddy comment, I don't know, did you guys pay attention to that here, which was said by Mark Rutte, the former Dutch prime minister, and the Secretary General of NATO? That kind of language was interestingly used, that was not uncommon in Europe, just try and flatter Trump. This picture is exactly the kind of way that European leaders in some ways turn themselves into second-class citizens to please Trump. This is a picture, Trump loved this picture, which is all the European leaders sitting in small chairs facing him in the Oval Office. Okay, that's actually, that's Trump. What you can't see is Trump's about right here. And they're all like little boys sitting in these small chairs facing Trump. That's the German chancellor, the French president, the Dutch president. These are serious European leaders. There's Zelensky there. I think Zelensky, you could tell, really knows this is BS. They had to play this role, all right? And that's what we saw for much of 2025. And that, this is interesting, having discussions with European policymakers at this time. There was first, they went through different stages of grief. You might say first there was denial. Everything's going to be fine, it's going to be fine, in 4 years. J.D. Vance sort of put that bubble to bed in the Munich Security Conference, but then it was like, well, it won't be so bad. And then it became, well, we'll just keep our head down and make it through 3 years, 4 years, and then America will regain its senses. You could see the different stages. And that comes out in the behavior of France, Germany, and the UK. What was interesting is throughout 2025, I would argue France, Germany, and the UK are more pro-American than they've been in almost any time since the end of the Cold War, because they were desperate not to offend the United States. They sometimes give some great speeches. I mean, if you, like someone like Macron is fascinating, because if you read his speeches, they're great. All right? Macron will give ideas about the European ideal, European autonomy, European looking and thinking for itself and being able to defend itself, but then they didn't do anything. So there was a real gap between rhetoric and reality in the way the Germans, the French, and the British all went about it. Actually, the Germans did the most and spoke the least. I think what we've seen in 2025 and in 2026, the transformation of Germany might be the single most important element in Germany, and I'll talk about that later. The French talked a great deal and did nothing. And the British didn't even talk about it because they didn't want to do anything to threaten the special relationship. So yeah, that you might say, and they did almost nothing as well. So the powers did that. What I came to a bit of a conclusion, and there was, I spent a lot of time going to different European capitals, is that primarily we have a massive generational problem in Europe. That it was people, there were people, say, in their 30s and 40s who got it and knew that this was a new world and they should do something, but they simply don't have the power. The power are the people in the 50s and 60s. And those who had some recollection of the Cold War and the immediate Cold War period, they could not accept the fact that the United States would not defend them. To them, it was simply too much, and it was really a generational divide that was driving Europe in that. It also improved two things, that neither NATO or EU was at this point a body to take this forward. I mean, that NATO showed itself completely hamstrung because the US was in it. So in some ways, you could say NATO is a block on the Europeans thinking and acting for themselves. Because as long as NATO's in there, the Europeans can't, because the United States is by its nature going to dominate NATO. So NATO acts as a block on the Europeans doing this. And the EU had massive problems on this. One, because states like Hungary and Czech were in it. The European Union's own structure weakened it. And also, by the way, major powers like Britain and Norway aren't in it. So the EU has huge, and by the way, Ukraine's not in it. And you would say Ukraine is probably the most geopolitically important power in Europe right now. And so the European Union had trouble, which has been shown, by the way, in the reaction to the world to the US-Iran war, how the vision of Ukraine's strategic importance has changed in a few weeks is, I think, worthy of note. But the second Trump presidency, 2025, was a wasted year. Now, maybe it wasn't wasted because Europeans had to go through this process and they had to come to terms with it, but it did. However, I would say lately, I'm going to try to be optimistic now, all right? I've probably been really negative and depressing. Why I say I think this talk can be different now than a talk that I would have given, say, in November, is that the last few months have really drummed home to Europeans that the US, and I'm sorry to say this to a US crowd, cannot be trusted with their security. They now know it, all right? The US is not a reliable defense partner. The US government is closer to the Russian government than it is to most European governments now. It is not actually acting in Europe's security. And if I was going to start with one real moment of intellectual break, it was Greenland in January. This is something that has been fascinating to me, and I was talking to Guntis. How that's been discussed here and how that was discussed in Europe was fundamentally different. And what I've learned once I've been here is Americans, oh yeah, there was a Greenland crisis in January, but it was over in a week and everything's fine. All right? That's often that's how people, talk about Greenland, right? Do people spend much time talking about Greenland? You do? Okay, that's good. But you're probably like me, a little strange. They spend that. But for Europeans, they believed the United States was going to attack Greenland in January. The French and Germans sent troops to defend Greenland against American invasion. Now, they were about 100 troops, so it wasn't a large force. But they believed the Americans might come and kill them, all right? Because Trump was saying he would. And they were getting credible intelligence that this might happen. Even though Trump didn't do it in the end, they have not gone back from that. I mean, for the European view, this means that Trump could wake up any moment and attack a NATO country. All right? That's what it is. So the lesson wasn't this was a crisis, it's over, let's get back and be friendly. It was that the United States does not see us as anything important. It does see us, in fact, as a possible enemy. All right? And that is something from which Europeans, I don't think, have, and probably will not recover, which, by the way, is not necessarily a bad thing. The other one is the Iran war, which has also made a much bigger impact on Europe than you might know. One, because Trump didn't bother to consult them at all, even though he was potentially blowing up the European economy. All right? That what the United States did, it went to war, not thinking what would happen if the Strait of Hormuz was closed, without realizing if the Strait of Hormuz is closed, Europe is in real trouble. All right? You probably think, oh, it's bad that our gas prices are going up. Europe might run out of aviation fuel in 6 weeks. All right? That Europe is very close to a massive economic problem because of that invasion. And what the Europeans saw was the United States did not care. All right? It started a war with massive security implications to them, massive economic implications, and couldn't give two figs about what they thought. Only went to them when they needed help to get bailed out because the Trump administration didn't know what it was doing. All right? And that is not, again, something that you'll just get over. I think that is what has happened, is there have been some really, really important changes. The other one is that Orban losing, I think, has been a very important moment. It's given hope to more pro-European forces that populism can be stemmed. It's probably Fico and the Czech prime minister are not going to be as powerful as Orban. Orban was really plugged into Trump, really plugged into Putin, and Orban was able to do things that maybe the Czech and Slovakian governments can. So getting him away for a while actually removes a block. So on the one hand, skepticism of the US, I think, is now permanently much higher than people in America realize. And it's not going back. And on the secondly, there's now fewer institutional blocks. That being said, it does say right now, I do not think we are going to have a European-wide strategy. I still think that's not where we are. However, what we're most likely to have is what I'll call the coalition of the willing strategy. And that seems to have more legs than people think. All right? And that is, there is now a coming together of the we want Ukraine to win group with the we don't want Ukraine to lose group into a larger, we actually want Ukraine to win group. That states like Germany has undergone this transformation. All right? That the British too. The Dutch, by the way, have become far more hardline. You might not know that because you think Mark Rutte, but actually Rutte does not represent the Dutch government now. And so there's a larger coalition of the willing that is coming together within Europe to try and actually plan for a European response, a European strategy. If you want to look at a body that might do it, it's probably not one you've heard about, but it's called the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is a group of Northern European states, you might say, which was going to be an element of NATO. It was originally thought of as an element of NATO, but oddly it's now functioning almost as a quasi-European coalition of the willing for those that want to help Ukraine. In the end, though, it will probably have to be the European Union. I thought, I put up there, I have a picture. I have a picture of more words. That shows you just how exciting my PowerPoints are. What is interesting is that Volodymyr Zelensky gave this tweet just a few days ago. And it was one of the first examples of Europeans speaking openly about European strategic autonomy and thinking boldly. What he was doing is saying, okay, to begin, the US, it would be amazing to have thought a European leader will say openly, the US might leave NATO, we must do things. We must think for ourselves. Zelensky now is freed a bit to do that. And he said, okay, if the US leaves NATO, what do we do? Well, what we're going to do is actually work at that point through the EU. All right? And he wants to have, in many ways, of course, this is far too radical for the European Union. They're not going to take Turkey in. I don't see that happening. But what he's trying to call for here is a radical remaking of the European Union to be, in a sense, a European strategic body. And the European Union can do that. If you read the text of the European Union, there is actually a security component within it. No one's taken it seriously because they've looked to NATO. All right? So that even though the European Union has a security component, no one's used it. It's never been intellectually active, but it could be active now. So I just thought that Zelensky tweet was a fascinating moment, and it's worth following. Now, the first thing I'm going to say, and by the way, you might be able to tell, I am American. And when I say this with no satisfaction. All right, I actually, from my point of view, the Euro-American alliance has been one of the most important institutions of my life. I wanted it to continue. I don't believe it should continue now. I don't believe, actually, ultimately, I don't think it's healthy for Europe now. What it's revealed is that Europe had become so infantilized that it can't, and by the way, I do not believe the United States is trustworthy now, nor do I necessarily believe it will be again. I don't think we're going back. All right, maybe you'll have a solid American president, but maybe you won't. Who knows what's going to happen politically? And what all that means is that Europe can't rely on American politics being stable. The Europeans have to think on their own. So I'd say the number one thing for a European strategy going forward, as Zelensky refers to, is it has to be as free from U.S. influence as much as possible. Okay, as long as the U.S. remains in NATO, it will have some influence. But Europeans have to work outside of that influence, which is why they ultimately should work in the European Union, not NATO. It needs to understand that European interests, U.S. interests, are not identical to Europe, are in many ways even complementary. All right? What we're seeing in the Gulf is not even complementary interests. We are saying the U.S. being a threat to European interests, and you'd say in the U.S. relationship with Russia now, the U.S. is being a threat to European interests. So there cannot be even an assumption the U.S. will be your friend. It will be great if the U.S. is, and I want that as much as possible, but Europeans cannot assume that is the natural order of things. All right? And there is no, as I say, no reason the U.S. will revert to Atlanticism, and old systems were not healthy for the European states. The old way of doing business actually wasn't the right way. And this will require what I call a change in mindset. They have to, you would be surprised just how Europeans have deferred to the Americans institutionally for 60 years. American think tanks could basically write policy for European states. American diplomats had massive influence in European capitals, could sort of help write defense policies. And what I have seen in 2025 was completely for, I would say, well-meaning group by people who had a sense, is they use this influence to keep Europeans from looking out for themselves, all out of good intentions. The road to we know where is paved by good intentions. But you would see that from American analysts. They would basically go, don't worry, wait a little while, things will be better, we're going to go back to being normal. So the Washington voice, even by those who I think were fearful of what was happening, acted on a brake on Europe. All right? The Washington voice was in some ways, instinctively, not surprisingly, the American view. And the American view wanted to be, let's do what is ultimately best for the United States. Also, by the way, this is the piece I wrote today, the United States to me seems to me so profoundly to misunderstand war that the Europeans, if they are going to rebuild their defenses, the last thing they should do is listen to American analysts. And I know this is something that gets people in Washington very upset, but what I have seen in how the United States approached the war from 22 to 24, how the United States approached the war on terror, how the United States is approaching the war against Iran now, makes me believe that Washington does not understand. But the United States has been so big and powerful, it doesn't make a difference. The United States hasn't been harmed by its own failure to understand war. But what the Europeans can't do is, in some sense, just listen and build themselves up along American lines. They actually have to redo it. That's one of the reasons where Ukraine plays a massive role. And that has been a very interesting understanding, the growth of the understanding of the importance of Ukraine to the future of European security. I don't know if you've paid attention to the German announcements of the last week, the German-Ukrainian announcements. but there's a real combination of many areas of defense industry happening. And that is a sign, by the way, that Ukraine is vital to Europe's future. When you start having all this joint production, and it's, by the way, an understanding that Europeans can learn from Ukraine. So that is the kind of thing you might say, as the Europeans pivot from the US, they pivot towards Ukraine. All right, so that's sort of a natural pivot that's going on. So again, I do not say this with any happiness. I say it with a lot of regret. But ultimately, Europe now has to move away from the USA for the sake of its own security and its own future. And then there are the immediate questions. What should they do? This are sort of the 4 or 5 things that I think Europeans can start, in many ways, talking about now. I'd be happy if they really started seriously talking. They can make some moves towards these in a more concrete way, and there are some concrete elements. But these are the immediate European strategic questions they need to start thinking about and planning for. One, they've got to do a much better job in coordinating their defense spending and production. You could not have wasted more money than the Europeans. I mean, Europeans didn't spend much money after 1990 on defense, but what they spent really poorly. Because basically, every country wanted its own tank. It wanted its own this, its own that, whereas it had huge cost inefficiencies. So when Edward and I were doing that article, we were saying, well, how many systems does the U.S. maintain? U.S. military maintains between 30 and 40 systems. By a system is a type of, a Patriot anti-aircraft battery is a system. So the U.S. military maintains approximately 30 to 40 systems. The Europeans had 130 to 140. So not only were they spending less than half the Americans were spending, they were spending it on 4 times as many systems. You can just wonder how efficient that is, okay? And these systems don't even work together. They can even have things that are supposedly interoperable, like 155 artillery pieces, and they're not interoperable. So the European whole structure has to be rethought. What European states have to do is trust each other and divide up, as I say, the pie analogy. Why is he talking about pies? What they have to do is say, I'm not going to have lots of small slices of pie. I'm going to have only a few slices, but much larger slices of pie. So there will be one frigate that Europeans build, and that will be built by a consortium. And those countries will get a big slice of the naval pie. There'll be one armored personnel carrier that they build, and that will be another consortium, and they'll get a big slice of that pie. But they need to actually build rationally and have interoperability across the continent. And that is going to be harder than you think, because that's not the way they are programmed to act. But they have to. If not, they don't want to waste their increased defense spending. The other thing, one thing that they have totally punted on over the last 30 years, because this is what the United States could do for them, is logistics and resilience. They have no ability to deploy anywhere. The British were said, could you send any troops to the Baltic? Well, maybe 100. They simply cannot deploy any kind of distance without the USA. So that is one area that needs immediate redress, is they have to start thinking about deployability and supply without relying on American sources. They don't have any, they're so far behind in that is immediate. And they don't need, and they had, by the way, in terms of that, then they have to have a very European center. I mean, it actually would be good, because they have to stop thinking globally. They need to think, okay, how do I get troops to Eastern Europe? That's what they need to think about. How can they actually defend against Russia? And they should stop worrying about having a global projection. They don't need a global projection. They need logistics and resilience to fight in Europe. A big question is the third one. And this one I know there's conversations on, and it's really tricky. They have, their entire nuclear deterrence basically comes down to 4 submarines, and 2 of them don't work. Okay? The British have 2 submarines, and the French have 2 submarines, and usually one of them for each country is in dock with serious servicing problems, i.e., they really don't have much of a nuclear deterrent. And moreover, it's not European. The British control the British nuclear deterrent, and the French control the French nuclear deterrent. So there is no European deterrent. What there is are a submarine for each country, and it's that. The U.S. nuclear umbrella, this is, I think, more understood. They know it's gone. They're not going to say that because they don't want the Russians to act on that. But they know, Trump is not going to use nuclear weapons to defend Europe. He's simply not going to do it. And they do understand that. But that means that Europe is now facing Russia, which in many ways has military problems, but still has a stonking large nuclear arsenal. So they need to find a way to deter that Russian nuclear arsenal. That will require a European response, all right? Because the states in the East have to actually feel that deterrent is there for them. What happens in next year if the French elect the National Front, and 2 years after that the British elect Reform, two populist parties who are in many ways pro-Putin, then there is no European nuclear deterrent. So you need to actually start thinking about a European nuclear deterrent, and they are starting to do it. It's terrifying. The other option is more European states build nuclear weapons than you think. If you don't think the Poles are taking this on very seriously, you're fooling yourselves. All right? You don't think the Ukrainians are thinking about this very seriously, you are fooling yourselves. All right? If they do not believe there is a European nuclear deterrent that will defend them, they will go down the road. By the way, this is happening in South Korea. I was talking about someone today. South Koreans are very close to thinking about to actually developing their own nuclear weapons. But that is an area where I hope there would be a European deterrent to stop everyone from getting their own nuclear weapons, a European deterrent with a European command structure. And the second one, the fourth point goes below that, there has to be, therefore, command and control. If you have something like a European nuclear deterrent, you need a European command and control. Right now that doesn't exist, it's only NATO. So they need to start coming up with a European command and control system. And in many ways, what they can't have is an American supreme commander. If the U.S. is the supreme commander, you will never have a European command and control. And that, I think, links into the last question. Ultimately, then, it will all come down to the new structure, whether it is an expanded EU, whether it is a NATO without the USA, whether it is a coalition of the willing that grows and grows and grows like the JEF. Ultimately, this will live or die on the structure that comes in place. So these are 5 massive questions. Right now, I would say the most that we are down, any of them is maybe 10%. Most of them we might be 1 or 2% down the road. But at least we know, I would say, what Europe needs for an actual European strategy. And I think the really positive news is more people in Europe understand it than before. So hopefully you're not too depressed with that. And I will call an end to the lecture now. So thank you.
We have time for some questions, and I was thinking of maybe grouping several questions at a time. Please announce who you are, and we'll collect 3 questions, and we'll move on. Let's start with.
So, as an energy person and an ex-Ipswich, North Shore.
Oh, Mass Boy.
Yes.
Oh, there you
absolutely.
go.
Not boy.
Yeah.
Scott Montgomery, Jackson School lecturer. One of the big questions that people in the energy world have is whether the U.S. was directly involved in convincing the Europeans to shut off Russian gas and oil, or whether they came up with that and pursued it on their own.
You mean the Nord Stream 2 pipeline?
I mean all of the pipelines.
Well, some of them are still functioning.
Yeah, there's some still working, but definitely the Nord Stream and Russian gas.
Let's collect some.
Hello, thank you for the amazing presentation. My name is Nino. I'm coming from the country of Georgia, and it is this topic is very dear to my heart. I have so many questions, but I will try myself to narrow it down. And you have mentioned this whole European perspectives from all these years, and we know it very well from 2008. Everyone some European countries have sent this Tagliavini, I don't know who that person is again, she said, okay, the war hasn't started by Russia, but it was some kind of a misunderstanding, and then 2014 happened, nothing, just formal sanctions, and now we are here. My question is, how do you see, is there a possibility of kind of not just the European countries waking up, but also other middle powers, as has the Canadian Prime Minister said that,
okay.
and how that might play out. Not just Canada is joining them, but also like you've mentioned South Korea and also Japan and other countries. And my second question is, I'm sorry for that, is that how we've talked about Europe and how that affects Europe, but how do you think that this foreign policy, changing foreign policy, impacts the U.S. itself, like U.S.'s internal governance and the future in some sense? Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You're holding on to these questions and one more person.
Does anyone have a pen that I could quickly, so I don't forget? I'll give that back. I promise I'll give it back to you.
Oh, thank you very much for such an interesting and provocative talk. I'm Glennis Young. I teach in the history department in the Jackson School. I was wondering if you could explain or talk a little bit about the transformation of Germany, which you mentioned, which I've also noticed because I'm a faithful listener to German radio, and what role Germany in particular might play in what you've called this plan for a new structure going forward.
All right, I'll handle those. I'm going to handle them. Start with the German one. The German change in the last 4 months has been remarkable. And I think that Greenland made a big deal to that. Basically what the Germans are doing is talking about leading the European military rebuild. The Germans leading Europe is not a natural, instinctive thing. Okay? Well, not for a while. And what the Germans have been very careful throughout this, from 2022 to 2024, they were probably the most deferential to the USA. That they were the ones following the U.S. lead to the letter. And they also liked what the U.S. was doing, so that Schultz and Biden were very much aligned. But the Europeans were not the Germans were not that aggressive. The British and the French actually gave kinds of weapons the Germans wouldn't give. So they gave the Storm Shadows and Scalps. And so the Germans seemed to be doing what we might say typical German stuff in the way that they were holding back, giving money, giving defensive weaponry, but providing no leadership. Arguably now, Germany is leading this process. I think that's the big change, that they are now allying with the Ukrainian defense industry. They are spending a lot of money. The British say they'll spend a lot of money. They're not spending it yet. The Germans are spending it. So the Germans are actually rebuilding their defense industrial base right now. The head of the German armed forces said the other day, and this almost took my breath away, we expect to be at war with Russia in the next 5 years. All right. Now, by the way, he's only saying that because the unspoken thing is we expect the U.S. is gone. All right. You don't say that if you believe the U.S. is with you. All right. So the Germans, you might say, they've crossed the Rubicon intellectually and in many ways capability-wise, and that does provide leadership. I mean, if the Germans want to do it, they can provide the leadership for this process because they still are the largest European economy, and they still have a very sort of developed technological production base. They have a large population, so the Germany is very important to this. That neither the British or French could do it. The Germans could probably do it, particularly if the Germans can get together with the Poles. The German-Polish axis is going to be very important. So that transformation, and I've seen it, but my wife's German. So we go to Germany all the time, and in discussions with Germans, it has been fascinating to see this change. So it's real. Okay, the middle power question. Let's start with that. Yes. I mean, in many ways, of course, the Canadians would like them to go further now. Canada, this is one of the things, Canada didn't go through the stage of calling Trump daddy. because Trump actually threatened their sovereignty from the moment he became president, when he said 51st state. By the way, the Canadians took that really damn seriously. I mean, and they changed their politics. So they were going to have a huge conservative government, and Trump comes in, and the Liberal Party, Carney becomes prime minister. And now, by the way, Carney has a full majority. So in fact, the Canadians have continued to back that. And so what the Canadians would like to do is, combine, you're not to join the European Union, but to imagine their defense and their relationship with Europe as separate from their relationship with the USA. They would love to take part in these sort of arms production, combined arms deals. And so that is, I think, a very likely thing, that Canada and the European states will get closer. Japan is also the really interesting one, in South Korea. There's more possibility on that than people think, but the Japanese and South Koreans are still in the stage they don't want to offend Trump. So they're going to be very careful about what they say. If the South Koreans do come out and build a nuclear weapon, I think you can say that's over. They're not worried about the US anymore. But if you want to talk about not the most pleasant synergy, the best way that the Europeans can actually come up with a nuclear system is the Europeans can make the warheads, but they have no ability, or they really would struggle with the delivery system, because their delivery systems are entirely US-based, or mostly US-based. Japanese could build great missiles. They make really good missiles, the Japanese. In fact, they're building a whole conventional missile system to try and deter the Chinese. They won't go nuclear themselves, but they're building a very large conventional missile force. So actually, there's a lot of, the Europeans and the Japanese could combine the Japanese delivery systems with the European warheads. So that's one. And what's the first question you had?
About how foreign policy
In the US? You guys tell me that. You don't need me to come tell you that. I mean, I don't know. What I've just found is, on the whole, Americans don't spend a lot of time thinking about foreign policy. It's still a domestically driven. So I don't, I see this as, America seems to be, not surprisingly, staring at what's going on in America. And it's an internal question. The energy question, oh boy. First of all, they didn't shut all the pipelines down. It was actually the Russians at first embargoed oil to try and to get it in, and then the Russians started shipping oil through Ukraine. I mean, there's many weird things in this war, but the pipeline that went through Ukraine to supply Hungary, which the U.S. government told the Ukrainians they had to keep open. There's certain things that have gone on. The Europeans have been desperately trying to wean themselves off of Russian energy, and they were doing a good job. But then, of course, Trump goes into the Gulf. The Iraq War helps Putin on so many levels. But one of the big ones is it just means Russian oil income is skyrocketing, because the price of oil has gone up, and basically everyone's buying any oil that's on the market is consumed. I think you would say it's the great failure of the Europeans to, what is the great European hope? They really thought if we did business with Russia, it would all work out. And they were wrong. And that's, I understand the motivation, but the European view, if we build Nord Stream 2, Russia will never go to war because, we'll be so interconnected. Actually, had Nord Stream 2 come online, Europe might not have been able to resist, because then it would have been entirely dependent on Russian oil. So the energy question is fascinating.
Those are gas.
Yeah, that's the one that was going to come. Yeah.
My question was whether the Europeans thought of weaning themselves off
Oil.
on their own, or whether they got it from the U.S. That key idea.
Well, I don't think the U.S. played a huge amount in that part of their thinking, but they didn't. They still haven't weaned themselves off of it.
Not entirely.
Yeah, yeah. No. And I don't think they will wean themselves off of it. Yeah. But I think my understanding of that was primarily a European discussion.
Let's toss off 3 more questions. I apologize to the questioners. We won't get all the questions, but we have 40 hours of discussion coming after this.
I will not be here for 40 hours.
And then I will have to be, we're going to keep them short and pithy, and we will have to reconvene tomorrow.
Chris Jones at the Jackson School. there are scholars, and you already know them, who argue that all this tension and problems you've addressed began in 2014 when the United States and the United Kingdom did not honor the terms of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. Do you agree with that?
Yes. I mean, the reaction, well, I mean, I'll just say yes. But I'll come back to that.
Hello, my name is Jana Koz. I teach Ukrainian language here at this university, and in 2 months going back to my hometown, which is Kiev, Ukraine. That is why your talk is not only interesting and curious, it's crucial for me. So the 2 questions I have, the first one would be, how would you assess the possibility of the coalition of the willing to be a driving force in what is happening? To be the driving force in the Russo-Ukrainian war. And the second question is, then, when it all started in 2022, in a lot of the media, European media, there were the talks about the joint military, European military. Yeah. But they were stopped by the argument that, no, we have NATO, we do not need the second military. What do you think is going to happen now? Is there the possibility that there would be some alternative to NATO, but on the European continent, involving only European countries? Thank you.
And a third question back here.
Thank you very much for your fascinating talk. I'm Maria Brenner from Austria, and for me as an Austrian, it is very crucial to know, or because I'm a European and we have different mentalities. Like there are the big leaders in the European Union, Germany of course, France, former Great Britain, and my question is, who would take the lead in the European Union, since there is no consensus on who should take the lead in the European Union. And I would like to also ask the question concerning military force for whole Europe. Like in Austria, for example, Austria is not part of the NATO. And we are really afraid, like what's going on now, because we really love you guys, but we have trust issues, since February 2026, so it's a really threatening situation, and we are running out of kerosene and stuff like that. So, what should we do on the European scene? Like not only creating a nuclear deterrence, but there is no consensus. So who should take the lead in the European Union?
Okay, those 3 questions? Okay. I'll be I can combine some of them because some of them overlapped. There's not going to be a European army. I don't think that, we have to deal within the coalition of the possible. So there's not going to be a European army. I think what you want is a European version of NATO, either as part of the European Union or acting in tandem. So it needs to be a military alliance with a unified command structure, but there will be independent. I mean, you'll still have the French army, the Austrian army, and all of that, but you want them to work together in the way like NATO works together, but under a European commander-in-chief. So I think that's the only reasonable structure is what it's going to be. It's not going to be a European army. So I don't see that happening in any way. Plus, I mean, the armies are still very different. It would take a while to bring them. By the way, I mean, Ukraine's going to have the most powerful army in Europe, so none of this can happen in some ways without integrating Ukraine into that. In terms of who's the leader, I mean, I'll defer to what I said. Of the present countries in the EU, the Germans are crucial to take the lead, and if the Germans take the lead, then they have natural allies in the Nordics and the Baltics and the Netherlands. And I think Poland is an interesting one because Poland might also want to take the lead. So that's why I said the Polish-German relationship is going to be really key. I could see something where the Polish actually get the military command and the Germans get the political command. That could be a way that you could finesse it. But the Germans are the only ones who could actually probably take the lead right now. The British can't, they're not in the European Union, and the French can't do it either right now. So I think it has to be, but Germany can, because Germany could lead that coalition of the willing. So I think that's probably the best way to do it. 2004 entirely. I mean, the world, the 1945 world arguably ended in 2014 because the key element of the United Nations, which was very clear, is that states are sovereign and independent and borders cannot be changed by force. That was, and by the way, that happened in the Cold War. You know, they didn't change borders by force, even at the height of the Cold War. But in 2014, this is the US and Europe together, basically said, well, actually, you can change borders by force, really. We're not that bothered if you do it. And I would think, actually, the world changed at that moment. Certainly, the Russians got the message that this is okay. And so in their minds, 2022 comes from 2014. You know, you could make that connection out. So absolutely, and it also proved to the Ukrainians that U.S. security guarantees are worthless. That's why I was in Kyiv in January and talked to a number of Kyiv military people and politicians and all of that. Privately, they'll say, we don't believe a single thing we're told about a security guarantee by the United States. The United States isn't going to fight for us. You know, they're using that as an attempt to fool us into giving up the Donbass. But that actually the U.S. security guarantee is meaningless. And I think that goes back to that experience. Yeah, you can't underrate the importance of 2014. Did I answer all the questions, sort of? Okay.
Finally, a very short question to end on. I hope note to end it all on a note of things are going bad. Definitely doesn't work. Do you see reason for optimism?
In some sense, there's hope. You know, if you look at, there's still, I think, a lot of common connections among the democracies. I would say the U.S. element of that is the weakest now. But, you know, if you look at the rest of the democracies, and I'm very heartened by what happened in Hungary, you know, that this is not like the game is over. And from the European perspective, I was in despair a lot in 2025. I'm in less despair now because I think the things have moved on in just the last few months. There's so much farther to go, and I'm also hopeful that that things might improve in America in 2026. I mean, my hope is that we're never going back. We shouldn't go back, but that Europe and America can be friends together. But in some ways, they have to be friends with a bit more independence, and that I don't think is impossible to imagine. So this is the most upbeat talk I've given in 3.5 years. So we'll end it on that.
Thank you very much.